Cognitive bias. These are errors in our thinking that we walk around with all the time as we make judgments and we make decisions. These are things that we can largely be unconscious of, or they're things that might sometimes sneak into our consciousness. And we become aware of them. We're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I actually think like that, or that I have these kinds of biased thoughts. But it's really important to study these types of errors in thinking, or these cognitive biases, so that we can recognize them and that we can challenge them. And that's actually one of my favorite things to talk about in this course, is just how much we move about our daily lives really very, very unaware of these biases and how they influence our thoughts and our decisions and how we interact with other people. So we're going to talk about 3 different cognitive biases today. The first is confirmation bias, then hindsight bias, then representativeness bias. You're going to watch 2 pretty great short video clips on anchoring bias and availability bias later. Confirmation bias is what I'm not going to spend a lot of time on because we covered it at the beginning of the year. But essentially, remember that confirmation bias is when we only seek out information that confirms what we already believe is true, and we ignore evidence to the contrary. So if I sit down to write a paper about, pick your controversial issue that you already have an opinion on, right? If we were to sit down and write a paper and only seek out sources that support that opinion and ignore anyone with an opposing perspective, then we would be falling victim to confirmation bias. So a way of combating that is to find the people that disagree with you, and it might be uncomfortable, but if they're in person, actually engage them in a conversation, or go read articles from people, written by people who don't agree with you, and at least attempt to see other people's perspectives. Hindsight bias is the tendency for us to say that we knew something all along. So after something happens, our tendency to be like, oh, I knew that was going to happen. I could have predicted that was going to happen. And I love using this as an example of hindsight bias. No, you didn't, Taylor, right? But think about all the times we get into situations and we don't really like the outcome of them. So at the end, when it's all said and done, we try to comfort ourselves by saying like, oh, I knew that was always going to happen. That's an example of hindsight bias. Representative bias is very important to understand, especially when it comes to our judgments of other people that are not like us, that don't look like us in particular. A lot of people, I would argue everyone, harbors unconscious or implicit biases about other groups of people. And I say this because there's plenty of research and plenty of studies on babies and young children on their reactions to people who don't look like them, people of a different race, for example. And to an extent, our brains are wired to view people that look like us differently than people who don't. But as we start making sense of the world around us, we start taking in information from the world around us, we start forming ideas in our head of what particular groups of people should be like, right? We have prototypes, or we have mental images. We have images in our minds of what we think a person from a particular group looks like. And this means that as we move about the world, we're sizing people up based on these prototypes without ever getting a sense for knowing them or delving deeper. Think about a jury. Their perception or their prototype of a criminal could influence their decision, right? To what extent does the person sitting in front of them resemble what a, quote, criminal looks like, or their prototype of a criminal? So representativeness bias, let's break it down. Representative. Is the individual in front of us representative of a prototype we have for a particular group of people? If it is, and we're just accepting that person fits that prototype, or that this prototype is true, then we're falling victim to representativeness bias. Here's another example. So here is an actual experiment that was done by Tversky and Kahneman They presented the following description to a group of participants. So I'll read you this description that they provided to their participants in their experiment. Tom W. is of high intelligence, although lacking in true creativity. He has a need for order and clarity and for neat and tidy systems in which every detail finds its appropriate place. His writing is rather dull and mechanical, occasionally enlivened by somewhat corny puns and by flashes of imagination of the sci-fi type. He has a strong drive for competence. He seems to feel little sympathy for other people and does not enjoy interacting with others. Self-centered, he nonetheless has a deep moral sense. So in your mind, what prototype does Tom fit? Are you already hearing a description of Tom and assuming that he fits a particular prototype, say a particular college major? Let's look at what the participants were asked to do when they were divided into 3 different groups. The first group was asked how similar Tom was to one of 9 different college majors. The majority of the participants in this group believed Tom was most similar to an engineering major, and least similar to a social science major, like a psychology major, for example. Participants in the second group were asked to rate the probability that Tom was one of the 9 majors. The probabilities given by the participants in the second group were very similar to the responses from the first group. In the third group, participants were asked a question unrelated to Tom's description. They were just asked to estimate what percentage of first-year graduate students were in each of the 9 majors, so this is your control. Findings. People were likely to believe Tom was an engineering major based on representativeness because, in other words, he represented their prototype of an engineering major. Ignoring all other kinds of pertinent information, such as the fact that there's only a very small number of engineering majors on campus, the likelihood or the probability that Tom is of a different major, maybe a history major, for example, is actually much more likely. So just to recap representativeness bias, when we look at an individual and they represent for us a particular prototype, even though odds are good that they don't fit that prototype and they're not part of it or representative of it, we are committing the error of representativeness bias.